The reading is from a speech that Winston Churchill gave in 1941 at his old school, Harrow. You cannot tell from appearance how things will go. Sometimes imagination makes things out far worse than they are. Yet without imagination, not much can be done. Those people who are imaginative see many more dangers than perhaps exist, certainly more than will happen. But then they must also pray to be given that extra courage to carry this far-reaching imagination. But for everyone, surely, what we have gone through in this period, I'm addressing myself to the school, surely from this period of 10 months, this is the lesson. Never give in, never give in, never, 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 never in nothing, great or small, large or petty. Never give in, except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. We stood all alone a year ago, and to many countries it seemed that our account was closed. We were finished. All this tradition of ours, our songs, our school history, this part of the history of this country, were gone and finished and liquidated. Very different is the mood today. Britain, other nations thought, had drawn a sponge across her slate, but instead our country stood in the gap. There was no flinching and no thought of giving in, and by what seemed almost a miracle to those outside these islands, though we ourselves never doubted it, we now find ourselves in a position where I say that we can be sure that we have only to persevere to conquer. Ya Ukrainiec. I am Ukrainian. Not quite the impact that Kennedy had in Berlin saying, Ich bin ein Berliner, which actually translates into I'm a donut, but never mind. But I am Ukrainian, at least in this important sense. My mother was born in Odessa in 1905. Odessa at that time was part of the Russian Empire, and I'll actually point to these two handouts that I hope you all have, these two maps. But let's look at this one, the one with the yellow splotch at the top. All the red that you see, pink at the bottom, was that part of Russia in 1905 where my mother was born. Until 1922, all of that was Russia. It was not Ukraine. Crimea, down right at the bottom in the lighter pink, was added in 1954, not Ukraine at the time. The significance of all of that starts to, I think, strike immediately because we all know just where Mr. Putin is concentrating his forces at this time, and it is in that formerly Russian area that he is concentrated. But more on that later. The necessity, I think, is to give some sort of a very short, and as short as I can, history of this situation, because it's important to understand at least one of the necessary conditions of Putin's thinking that is based on the history of this region and how this all happened. So I'll try to do the very condensed version, except that it reminded me of my freshman year history course, Western Civilization course at Utica College, where the final exam question was, trace the development of Western civilization since 1750. That's a quote. That was oh, okay, here we go. So trace the development of Ukrainian history in 5 minutes. All right, but it's important. I think it's got to get done. In the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, Vikings, mostly from the east coast of Sweden, invaded into Russia, into its massive river system from the Baltic heading south. And they developed trade routes, and their basic trade commodity for those first years was slaves. They captured the people of the forest, that they called, whom we now call Slavs, and captured as many in those several centuries as 2 million of those people, transported them basically mostly to Constantinople, but also to other regions of the Black Sea area where they were sold into slavery. The term slave comes from Slav. That's the root of our English word for slaves and slavery. As the Vikings matured in place and set up cities and set up trading posts and forts, they melded with the local population. They came to be called Varangians. This went on and developing through those several centuries, till finally in the 10th century, early in the 10th century, they created a state called the Kievan Rus. By then they were called the Rus, the root obviously of Russian and of those languages. They were called the Rus, and they formed a state centered in Kiev ultimately, and it was known, that state is known to history as the Kievan Rus. It was the largest state in Europe at the time. It extended from the area that we now think of as Ukraine, central Ukraine, Kyiv, and the Dnipro River Valley, north almost to the Baltic, and I think in some cases as far as the Baltic Sea in the north. That state, the key part of that experience to know is this. In 988, the Kievan Rus prince, Vladimir in Russian, as in Putin, Volodymyr in Ukrainian, as in Zelensky, for important reasons we need not discuss, converted to Orthodox Christianity. And he did that at a church in Crimea. His seat of government was Kiev, but the conversion occurred in Crimea. That date, that fact, is the, I think, seen by the Russians, by the Ukrainians as well, as the moment when the Rus were really created, when Russians were really created. The melding of the Slavic and before that obviously melded into the Viking, the Scandinavian popular culture, married to Orthodox Christianity, became the definition of what it meant to be Russian. And those things are not separable, and it's important to know that because, for instance, you need to know why my grandfather, who lived in Belarus, could never be a Russian, and shows up actually on the internet is the 1907 Duma voting list. My grandfather is there, and they have the name, and then they have nationality. So-and-so's a Russian, so-and-so's a Russian. My grandfather, Jew. The nationality is Jewish. You ain't Russian, you're never going to be Russian. You don't get to be Russian, I don't care how many generations you're here. Russian means the marriage of Slav and Orthodox Christianity. That state, Kievan Rus, then as an Orthodox state, and a very evangelical one, Vladimir immediately ordered the entire population converted. You're all going down to the river, you're all getting baptized, and that's it. And anything else, the remnants of paganism were severely repressed. The state lasted until the 1230s, 40s, when the Mongol invasion eliminated that. And the Mongol horde, the Golden Horde, occupied the eastern part of Ukraine. Again, looking at these maps, look at the other map, the different colored one. I think I dropped that, but I know what it says. The Golden Horde fundamentally occupied that which is shown as pink on this map. And after the Golden Horde, after the Golden Horde started to dissolve and become weak in the 15th century, we start to see the beginning of what we can think of as Ukraine as opposed to Russia. And that grows out of the Cossacks, the Cossack movement. Ukraine's history is intimately related to the history of the Cossacks. And the first Ukrainian state, if you go back to the other piece of paper, this one, it shows Ukraine in 1654. That was a state formed by the Zaporizhian Cossack host the Cossack, there were many hosts, there were many different Cossack bands throughout the steppe region of Ukraine and going easterly into the steppe regions north of the Black Sea. The Cossacks, I tried to think about how do you describe the Cossacks? What were the Cossacks? They were ethnically a combination of Slavs, a lot of escaped serfs. Serfs were constantly running away from Ukraine and Russia. The serf system was well entrenched by then. They were running away and joining Cossack bands. I think that the best description I could come up with is, if you imagine the Indians and the cowboys all combining into one bunch that's riding around the Wild West on horses, and add a dollop of Viking so you get the proper flavor of this outfit, okay? Those were sort of the Cossack bands. They were entirely independent. It was the Wild West. While they were nominally under the suzerainty of somebody, the Tsars, the Tatars, somebody, they were basically an independent batch. In 1654, the leader of the Zaporizhian Cossack host, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, never get it right, basically formed the kernel of a nation there. Bohdan Khmelnytsky is a horrific boogeyman in Jewish history. This is a name known to me since childhood in relation to his having orchestrated and administered the largest pogrom in history outside the German Holocaust, outside the Nazi Holocaust. Thought that something like 300,000 Jews were killed in the midst of this. It was not designed as an anti-Jewish pogrom. It was designed as a rebellion against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In this map, the sort of orangey area up here, had been absorbed over the centuries, starting with the Mongol collapse, by a variety of different polities which wound up formulating into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which by the 15th century had become the largest state in Europe, encompassing all that we now know of Poland, Belarus, Western Ukraine, and various other areas. And the Poles viewed Ukraine just like the Russians view Ukraine as a source of plunder. And the Jews, unhappily, were positioned there basically as the tax collectors and enforcers for the Poles. So they were horribly unpopular, and when a rebellion broke out against Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Jews were in the crossfire. Khmelnytsky succeeded in creating this mini-state. He then went to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and said, all right, look, I'm beating you on the field. I want you to recognize me, and this is really critical, as the Prince of Rus. He was still 600 years after Vladimir Volodymyr, 400 years after the Kievan Rus state had collapsed. He was saying, I want to be recognized as the Prince of the Rus. And that capsulates this break that we're now witnessing, with both the Ukrainians and the Russians claiming ownership of the Kievan Rus history, of that starting point in the culture. Why does Vladimir Putin keep saying Ukraine is not a real country? We are one people. It all relates back to and roots in the reality of this singular root to them both in Kievan Rus, but then the question of who owns that history becomes a war that they continue to fight. It was important to the Tsars, quickie Russian history, the Golden Horde ran what we think of as Russia for a couple hundred years. In the 1450s and 60s, the Prince of Muscovy at the time, Ivan III, declared himself independent of the Golden Horde, refused to pay, which basically meant I'm not paying you tribute anymore, just not paying anymore. And he managed to fight them off, and he managed to start expanding the property of the Russian, at that point, the Prince of Muscovy. 1454, Constantinople falls to the Muslims, to the Ottoman Turk. So the seat of Orthodox Christianity, to which the Russians and the Eastern Ukrainians adhered, was now eliminated in terms of its administrative base. Ivan III said, "It's all now in Moscow. We are the third Rome," because there was Rome, and then the headquarters moved to Constantinople, where the Orthodox Church lasted for another 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And now Moscow is going to be the third Rome. His and at that point, Russia began its inexorable expansionism. And one of the key elements in this whole drama is the extent to which Russia has, since at least the 1450s, been a devoted expansionist power. Ivan III vastly expanded the size of his realm. His grandson, Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, proclaimed himself Tsar. He was the first Tsar of all the Russias. And again, hear that clang, Tsar of all the Russias. Didn't say Tsar, they didn't call himself Tsar of Russia, of this place, but of all the Russias. So if you are of the Rus, you're ours. The other item to bear in mind about the Cossack state, the Ukrainian state, is that by that time you started to have, because of these political separations, you started to have the kind of cultural separation that is as problematic as it is. By that time, Khmelnytsky, they were speaking Ukrainian. They weren't speaking Russian. They're very similar languages. They're obviously closely related, but they're not the same. And that issue became really dominant slightly later on. Khmelnytsky gets a small state. The Poles won't deal with him. He goes to the Russian Tsar and says, recognize us as some sort of vaguely autonomous thing, and we're now your guys. And that's what happened. And that's a fundamental historical claim that Putin gets to make, that Khmelnytsky sold Ukraine to the Russians in 1654 was the date of that treaty, and that's why it's indicated on that piece of paper. Time goes on. The Russians keep expanding. 1700s, Peter the Great is pushing relentlessly south and north both. He is involved in the Great Northern War with Sweden. In 1709, Charles XII of Sweden, who was a psychotic war maker and interested apparently in life and nothing but war, had attacked Russia. They were having this little to-do. And generals, the favorite Russian generals, the most effective Russian generals, Winter and Frost, defeated Charles XII at Poltava in Ukraine. Important to note, because part of what goes into the mix of this mess is Russian paranoia, and I'll get a little more specific about that in a minute, but Ukraine was seen, at least since the time of Peter, as part of Russia's fundamental strategic depth that protected them from everybody who was out to get them. And in 1709, Charles did indeed freeze to death, and Peter was able to overcome the Swedish attack at Poltava because Winter got them, and distance got them, and strategic depth got them. Peter incorporated some of the portions of eastern Ukraine at that time. Things then ground along for about a half a century or so. Catherine the Great comes to the throne. Catherine is a relentless acquisitor of Western art, Western thinking, Western intellectuals, Western pottery and Western manufacturers, and real estate. She loved real estate. And she is the one who brought in Novorossiya, this whole southern section that we see on this map. This was incorporated into the Russian Empire by Catherine in the 1780s and 90s. At the same time, in a separate move, she also took over Crimea, defeated the Crimean Tatars, the Crimean Khan, who operated the place, the successor of the Golden Horde. They were eliminated by Catherine or overrun by Catherine, and all of that was integrated into Russia. Odessa was founded in the late 18th century by Catherine's favorite and sometimes lover and major political operative and military operative Potemkin, who created the city, established the city, and built a whole lot of things, none of which included Potemkin villages, but never mind that. A myth, but a good, useful one, particularly now for other reasons. We have a Putinkin military, we have a phony military that looks a lot like Potemkin villages. So now Ukraine, and then finally, you see added 1654 to 1917. Finally, in the 1790s, Catherine does her final acquisition of all of that western part of Ukraine, except for the very tip at the end, which had been Austro-Hungarian, in the final partition of Poland in the 1790s, when she, Frederick the Great, and Maria Theresa of Austria chopped up what was left of Poland and took it over. That had been the part of Poland that Catherine took. Ukraine, as we know it now, except for, adding those parts, but Ukraine and the center of Ukrainian culture is now entirely in Russian control. And what do? They start suppressing it relentlessly. By 1804, laws are passed making publication in Ukrainian illegal. A little later in the 19th century, all Ukrainian, everything was suppressed relentlessly. It couldn't be spoken, it couldn't be published, it couldn't be printed, you couldn't have literature in Ukrainian. Certainly the schools were all in Russian. This happened in Poland proper itself as well when the Russians took over. Famous stories about Marie Curie, since she was rather brilliant and could speak Russian, but she's in a Polish school. When the Russian inspectors came, when the education inspectors came to make sure everything was going right in the school, they had to give Marie new wigs and move her from classroom to classroom because they needed somebody. Yeah, all in Russian. Yeah, speak Russian. Oh, yes, you. Same person moving from classroom to classroom in front of the inspectors. Relentless suppression of everything Ukrainian. So that ain't new, folks. Just saying. That was an element in it. Not just repression, but real terror, real starvation, over and over and over. This isn't the first time that Russia has attacked Ukraine as a terrorist organization. It's happening now. I think that's the quickie history that you kind of need to know to see the background of this and to be able to talk about Mr. Putin, which is what I want to turn to next, because around 2,500 years ago in China, there started to appear some writings known as collectively as the Art of War, written by an unknown person or group of people who are simply referred to as the Sun Master. Sun Tzu is shown as the author, but that's a title, not a fact. And the very first rule in Sun Tzu's Art of War is know your enemy, know yourself. There are things about Vladimir Putin that seem to have made it impossible for him to know either his enemy or himself. Vladimir Putin obviously had the image of himself that all of us had of Russia. This big, humongous, overbearing, overwhelming bear, strong as can be, vicious as can be, claws a mile long, all with the face of Vladimir Putin on it. Putin's history is important to us because I think it tells us what we can expect and what we need to know. The very first thing about Vladimir Putin that is always what goes through my head is that he's a Chekist. Now, I use that term not to just be pedantic because I think it really tells you a whole lot. The Cheka was the organization founded by Lenin in 1917 as and I won't get the whole name right, it doesn't matter. Cheka is an acronym, one of these Soviet style, you always saw dozens of contractions and acronyms that they loved. Cheka was an acronym. It meant something about the Extraordinary State Commission to Repress Counter-Revolutionary Activity. It's not a quote, but it's close enough. That was pretty much the title. The Cheka was not simply incidentally a terrorist organization. It was created as a terrorist organization. One of its first duties, apart from actually trying to identify you and you and you as a counter-revolutionary, one of its very first objectives was to institute the Red Terror. This is their term, not mine. That's Lenin's term, and the founder of the organization itself, Felix Dzerzhinsky, whose statue, by the way, still stands in Moscow, though not in front of the headquarters anymore. They moved it to they had good taste to move it to a park someplace, but never tore it down. One of the most vicious human beings in the history of the world. Their purpose was to impose the Red Terror on Russia to secure and maintain Bolshevik power. The thought was you terrorize the population into this. Lenin notoriously said, yeah, it's important to execute one guilty guy, but it's more important to execute 10 innocent ones, to scare the crap out of the rest of them, to keep them in line. So the very DNA of the organization that Mr. Putin grew up in is terror. And the term Chekist, calling him that instead of all the new, they went from the Cheka to the OGU to the NKVD to the MVD and finally the KGB that we're all familiar with. Whatever the names that got changed to protect the guilty, even the current batch, the post-Soviet batch, the RSF or whatever the new title that doesn't change anything happens to be, still celebrate Cheka Day, which is December 20 or 21. That was the founding date. And in 2017, on the 100th birthday, Putin attended Cheka Day, made a speech at Cheka Day praising the secret police, whether Soviet or whether now currently Russian Federation, and also pointing out, and here's the key quote, I have seen in print Putin quoted on that day as saying this: once a Chekist, always a Chekist. There are things you don't get to be X. I lose my stuff every time they say former KGB agent Putin. There ain't no former KGB agents. They don't come in that flavor. That's like former mafia guy. You're not former. You're in all the way, and you're in forever. And if you haven't done anything, if you're not an active agent, you may be an inactive agent. You're still an agent. You still have duties to the organization that are lifelong. The secrets stay the secrets. Your mouth is sealed. And anything you learn, whenever you learn it, you got to report. Anytime for instance, in our CIA, if you've not been an active agent for 20 years, but some foreign government gives you a present, you report it right away. If you've been contacted by any you report it right away. The duties are lifelong, but more importantly, the attitude is lifelong. And the Cheka was born as a terrorist organization, and it trained its people relentlessly, and Mr. Putin went right through it from his young years on, totally indoctrinated in an organization which is utterly amoral, which is utterly devoted to the ends and justify any means. that there is no particular value to human life, there is no particular value to any institutions, there is only the organization, its power, and state power. Everything else is absolutely irrelevant. So there is nothing in the DNA of this organization, and hence in this man, that would persuade him to do anything that spared human life or human decency or human dignity anyway. He's a Chekist. He's also a Stalinist. He has expressed admiration for Stalin. Here we have mass murder on a routine scale, and, of course, significantly, mass starvation imposed by Stalin in Ukraine in the 1930s. Some 4 or 5 million Ukrainians are thought to have been starved to death in what Ukraine calls the Holodomor, the intentional and forced starvation of the population there, as Stalin stole all of the grain and sold it abroad to get hard currency to do what he wanted to do. Putin is an imperialist. He has expressed innumerable times his intention to expand the Russian Empire. This is so Russian. It is so typical. It has been the leitmotif of Russian czardom from the beginning. Expansionism, overawing your neighbors, imposing your will on your neighbors, seizing their property if at all possible, and constantly engaging in those efforts. After Catherine, the Crimean War in 1850, Nicholas I decided that Russia should have suzerainty or some sort of control over all the Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and should specifically be in charge of maintaining the security of Christian properties and so forth, regardless of denomination, in Jerusalem, and insisted upon that and was going to war with the Turks to do it. The bad news for the Russians was that the Turks had allies, the French and the British, who, despite their incredible incompetence in the Crimean War, it is truly something stunning to look at. Nonetheless, the Russians suffered 3 times the casualties that the French and British did, which is pretty stunning, really, and lost the war. But it was just this arrogant expression, I'm going to now do this. 1905, when Nicholas II was having various little problems at home, he decided to have a, quote, short and glorious war against Japan. The Russian fleet sailed from the Baltic to Japan, took 11 months to get there. By the time they got there, both the sailors and the ships were basically wrecked from the trip. And the entire Russian fleet was sunk in about an hour and a half by the Japanese at the Battle of Tsushima Straits. That didn't go so good, but at the same time, that's okay, because the Russian army at Mukden in Manchuria was then being wiped out by the Japanese army on land. And huge revolutions broke out in Russia at that time that really led to massive changes, though obviously not good enough. And then in his incredible sublime arrogance, and Putin just follows the track, in 1914, obviously Russia went to war in the First World War that didn't work out so well. So Nicholas assumed personal command and went to the front. And of course, we know what the rest of that story looked like. It didn't work out so well, but it just typical imperial expansion, imperial overreach, arrogance, and a real failure to understand what the other side was about. The Russo-Japanese War was certainly a really prime example of that. The Crimean War, not much better, and here we see the same thing again. An imperialist who was grossly offended by the breakup of the Soviet Union, who saw it as a Western plot against Russia, who saw it as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, and aims to reverse it. He has certainly been working full-time to suck Belarus back into his orbit, and looked like he had done so. Now it's a different day, folks. As Churchill pointed out, how different things might look after a year. He certainly was doing that. He has certainly expressed the thought that whatever used to be the USSR is properly Russian. Whatever was the Russian Empire is properly Russian. He has made noises about Kazakhstan, which caused the Chinese to make noises back, saying, "Don't you dare mess with Kazakhstan," because China's a little interested in Central Asia also, don't you know? So we have that imperialist element in this guy. Then we have the fantasist, megalomaniacal. He's spoken about Peter the Great. He obviously, in all of this imperial expansion thought, sees himself as being the new Vladimir the Great. They call the guy from 988 Vladimir the Great, but the current one has aspirations. It's 1,000 years. It's time for a new Vladimir the Great, and that was his plan. Just a fantasist and a megalomania. On top of that, of course, he's a paranoiac with a persecution complex. You can start to see this looks like a deadly mix, doesn't it? Russia's a paranoid country with much to be paranoid about. It's not really, when they're out to get you, you're not necessarily paranoid. Russia is, but historically it has been a problem. And again, strategic depth has served the Russians very well in the past with regard to those who attacked them. I mentioned Charles XII in the 18th century, Napoleon famously in the 19th century, Hitler famously in the 20th century. All saw their projects go down the drain because of this massive strategic depth, which allowed Generals Frost and Winter to come in and do their worst and solve the problem for the generally and usually inept Russian military. So that whole sense of the West is out to get us, this is all an attack by NATO on us, we were being threatened. Even the Pope said, well, the threat to bring Ukraine into NATO was, some justification for this, some basis for Putin's feelings and behavior and response. So this deadly paranoia, nobody's out to get Russia. The only thing anybody wants from Russia is gas and oil. Who wants to go into Russia? Nobody. What are they banging on a door? Anybody banging on a door to get into Russia? Everybody's banging on the door to get out of Russia. They're running as fast as they can. That ain't news. My parents in 1917 and 1921 were running away from Russia, and lots of people ran away from Russia before then and since then. It's a place you run away from. Nobody wants it, Vlad. It's all yours, okay? But we're not going to believe that. We're out to destroy Russia, and his paranoia just won't give up. The final piece of this is the Russian people themselves. And to the extent they bear fault in this, and to a large degree I view the Russians as just another set of victims of this ridiculous and hideous leadership they have. But to the extent they bear responsibility, I think it's from their not just tolerance, I'm almost going to say their love of one-man rule. They just don't seem to be able to get it that these one-man rulers, but then again, of course, this country has about 30-40% of its population that also thinks one-man rule would be a great thing. So, it's not an unknown phenomenon, shall we say. But they tolerated one after the other, either vicious or incompetent Tsar, and lived with it. They lived with the viciousness of Lenin and Dzerzhinsky. They lived with the viciousness of Stalin. They could barely throw off. The Soviet Union did them the favor of collapsing on its own. And sure enough, right back in it, not a half a generation later, sucked right back in. We like a strong leader, strong guy. Here, Vladimir Putin rides horses bareback with his shirt off. Oh, does judo, tough, strong man. Says strong things, Really love these guys who get up and say, I'm a tough guy, I'm strong. paper tiger. Garbage, but, they buy the talk. Stalin still gets something like 50% approval ratings in Russia. I mean, this is a population that has fallen for this repeatedly throughout history and continues to do so. And for that, I hold them responsible for this. So I said he's a Chekist and a Stalinist and a lot of other bad things, but I want to just focus on those for a minute because I think there are huge implications for that. The first one is, Coffey mentioned to me on the way down that David Brooks had published a piece saying that the Ukrainians should do a deal with Russia. They should back off. They should make a deal. The first implication of Chekist Stalinist is you can't make a deal. What could any deal with Vladimir Putin conceivably be worth? Never mind the paper it's written on. It's unspeakable. It's ridiculous. The Russians have already agreed to Ukraine's borders in the deals made in the 1990s, first creating the so-called Commonwealth of Independent States, which you haven't heard of much, but the Russians signed off on this at the time. They then entered into an agreement in Budapest in which the Russians and the Americans and a bunch of other people guaranteed Ukrainian borders and sovereignty because Ukraine was giving its nuclear weapons up, 3,000 nuclear warheads sent to Russia, and given a guarantee of territorial integrity and sovereignty by Russia to do that. You can't make a deal here. It's meaningless. You can collapse, you can give up, but you can't make a deal. He's a terrorist by profession, by training, by expertise. Don't expect anything less than terror from this guy. That's what we're going to get. And the worst part of those implications, to me, is he may be untouchable. Like Hitler, like Stalin, no matter how badly these people did, World War II is coming to a close. The Red Army is moving into Berlin. They had to shoot their way through every floor in the Reichstag to the last floor, the 8th floor, the last room. They had to shoot for every bloody inch of it. That war was lost to the Germans at Stalingrad in 1943. It took 2 more years to grind it out, and the Germans never gave up on it, and they never got rid of Hitler. Stalin, at the outset of World War II, 3 million Nazis on his border, 160 German divisions. All the artillery is there, all the tanks are there, all the planes are there. The generals are coming to him. We've got to get into defensive positions. He's obviously planning an attack. Hitler will not attack us. No, not happening. Spies came and told Stalin the date and time of the attack. Operation Barbarossa will launch at 3 a.m. on June 22nd. He had them shot. He refused up to the last second to go into any defensive posture. The Germans attacked. The Russian Air Force was destroyed on the ground. They were just pulverized. They were not in defensive positions, and they got within 12 miles of Moscow before the year was out. And yet, Stalin, this happens. The Germans invade. Stalin was as wrong could be, had set them up for the biggest calamity probably in history. Stalin withdraws to his dacha and apparently becomes simply virtually insensate. He's laying on his couch for 11 days. The Politburo finally shows up. He assumes they're coming to shoot him or arrest him. No. They're coming to beg him to get up and take the lead. Get up and... They were so crushed, and in both those cases, it's pretty obvious that the people around the leadership had been so crushed, had been so disabled to have a will of their own and to act on their own and to plan on their own, that they could do nothing but follow the leader, even if the leader took them right to catastrophe. Putin has done a marvelous job of making sure that all of the people around him are at each other's throats. He creates different organizations. There's the security organization, KGB, which was always a paramilitary as well as police or secret police organization. And this is an outfit that's got troops and guns and tanks. There's the National Guard, which is a whole other separate group of people with tanks and guns and all that stuff. And then there's the military. And all of these people circle each other, and they circle him, and he's got them all making sure that they all mistrust each other, and nobody can talk to anybody. He really may be untouchable from the top. The rest of the reasons, after the Chekists and Stalinists, the imperialists, the fantasists, the paranoid, the arrogant, pompous fool, those were the reasons for going to war. Coffee's pointing to the watch. I know, I can't help it. Everybody's going to have to suffer with me. Trace the development of Western civilization since 1750. Takes a minute. Excuse me. Anyway, here's the implication, another Churchill quote. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. And that is indeed where we are. There is certainly, without victory, no survival for Ukraine. There's no survival for Moldova. There's no survival for Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. Kazakhstan, we'll have to see how serious the Chinese really are. And where it goes from there, who knows? But we know that we are on a trajectory that goes no place good if this man isn't stopped. So Putin didn't know himself because he didn't know his military and he didn't know what his capacity was, and he made a complete hash of it. He also didn't know his enemy. We are at a moment when history is at a pivot point. And history was going to go in one of two ways. Churchill in 1940 was at a pivot point. And because of him, his personality, his willingness to get up and tell the British that they could achieve victory in a war that they'd already comprehensively lost. By the end of June of 1940, Hitler controlled the entire European continent. There was no significant military force arrayed against him at that time. And yet, Churchill just stood there and said, nope, gave voice to the heart of resistance and turned the pivot of history and changed it. So who's playing Churchill in this drama? Churchill, by the way, when he came to the premiership in 1940, had been in Parliament for about 40 years, had served in governments for about 30 years in all sorts of posts, including, most importantly, the Admiralty. He ran the British Navy, the civil side of the British Navy, for 3 years before World War I and during World War I. And then again for a year. Before that, he was a professional soldier. That was his first profession in life before he became a writer and politician. A world of experience. In this drama, at this hinge in history, playing Churchill, we have Volodymyr Zelensky, a 44-year-old Jewish comic actor. We are at a level of surreal here that defies all belief. Zelensky's party is known as Servant of the People. That's his political party on which he ran in 2019 for the presidency. Servant of the People was the name of his television show, which you can see on Netflix, in which he plays a history teacher who's filmed by a student raging on to a colleague about how awful the government is, how corrupt it is, how terrible the whole situation is. This gets taped. This is the TV show. The student puts it up on YouTube. It goes viral. The students come to him and say, you should run for president. He said, what are you talking out of your minds? Run for president. They then do a GoFundMe kind of thing and collect $20 million and bring it to his door and say, here's the money you need to run for president. Oh, He runs for president. He becomes president. There's Volodymyr Zelensky as a comic actor, which is what his career had been. Becoming the president of Ukraine in this TV show, you can watch it, and then you can look at reality, and you won't. I'm telling you, the Guinness Book of Records, surreal. Here it is, the winner, unbelievable. So this completely improbable character steps to the fore and has led the world in courage, in resilience, in doing exactly what Churchill did in 1940. No, we're not surrendering. No, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. The most powerful shot fired in this decade, if not this century. I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And it changed the world. And meanwhile, we have Putin on the other side making all the classic mistakes, starting with taking over leadership and running of the strategy and the tactics of the army. This was what, again, Churchill said in 1944 when Hitler had just escaped a bomb plot. Here's what Churchill said. Certainly it would be most unfortunate if the Allies were to... This is in July of 1944, by the way. Certainly it would be most unfortunate if the Allies were to be deprived in the closing phases of the struggle of that form of warlike genius by which Corporal Schicklgruber has so notably contributed to our victory. One of the key things that Hitler insisted on doing that led to Churchill saying that was his refusal to allow a strategic withdrawal, called a retreat in not so nice language. Would not allow it. So General Paulus von Paulus is begging him at Stalingrad. He's got 400,000 troops. I want to get these guys out of here. No retreat. Lost 400,000 guys. As Churchill later said, his strategy was to waste his armies on the periphery, and when it came time for the main event, the invasion of Germany, he had denuded himself of force and of troops. Putin is doing the same thing. He has ordered no withdrawal in Kherson, which is the southwesterly-most part of the operation. He's got 20,000 troops who are on the west side of the Dnipro River, which is about 3,000 yards wide at its narrowest point down there. It's a very, very wide stream. It's over a mile wide at its narrowest. They've blown up the real bridges across it. There are 20,000 Russian troops on the wrong side. They absolutely risk being cut off and surrounded, and it would be an incredible blow, and Putin will not let them withdraw. Generals have been asking for it. It's known they won't let him withdraw. So he's making all of those same mistakes, we hope. I will just briefly say I don't know what the end game here will be. I can't imagine. I don't think Putin will stop on his own ever more than Hitler did, ever more than Napoleon did, ever more than Nicholas II in the Russo-Japanese War did. I don't think he will ever stop on his own. He will have to be stopped. I think there is no force at the top to stop him. At the bottom, maybe. Army mutinies and naval mutinies breaking out like they did in 1905 could bring him down. But short of that, I think not. And the other sort of horrible news, I think, is that lost causes historically can still be very painful until they are really finished off. World War II was over for Hitler after Stalingrad, but it took 2 more years of bleeding and dying to end it. The American Civil War was over for Lee after Gettysburg, but it took 2 more years of fighting and dying to end it. So hard to know what might happen here. I think that more of Churchill's words are appropriate here, and you do the changes of the necessary names and places and words. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may go forward into broad sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and the Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. The Rus, Ukrainian and Russian and Belarusian, date themselves to Kiev and Crimea in 988, over 1,000 years ago. If they last 1,000 years more, this will be both their worst and their finest hour. Thank you. Comments, arguments?
First music.
First music.
Oh,